We are recording and everything, so take it away.
Well, to whoever has joined us, welcome to this discussion of Georgist Education. I hope that many of you have had the opportunity to look at the video that I prepared in advance. I wanted to give you something to really think about in terms of how long many of us have been at this task of trying to bring new information about how the world works to a broader public and to what effect that's going to have. As I prepared for leading this discussion, and we have Mike Curtis with us, and we're waiting for Bret Barker. I don't know if
Bret is here. Bret's here.
Oh, great. Bret, thanks for joining us too. Eventually, I'm going to get to ask them to give us a sort of a summary of their experience as a teacher and what they've learned over the years. Mike has had a very diverse set of experiences in teaching in all sorts of groups, including prison inmates, which is remarkable to me. And Bret has spent his career as a high school teacher using a very innovative approach to trying to get young people to understand economics and how the world works. But when I first started to prepare the video that I did on the history of our educational efforts, I was reminded about what John Berger, if some of you will remember John Berger from Minnesota, who was a longtime member of the Georgist community. And he was also a management consultant. He came up with a system he called MOST, which helped in developing planning. And it was based on this MOST concept: mission, objective, tactics, and strategy. And so I wondered, well, exactly where does education come into play when you're dealing with this MOST system? And from a mission standpoint, it seems to me, and you can choose to agree or not agree and have your own view, but it seemed to me that our mission, as people who've embraced the principles embraced by Henry George, that our mission is one, to change the world so that people experience real liberty, that there's real equality of opportunity, and that we have just law that's justly enforced. And that, to me, seemed like the essence of our mission. And what's our objective? Our objective then is, by achieving that mission, to really change the course of history. And changing the course of history is not something that anyone has ever taken on lightly. There are forces at work that have been at work for centuries, relationships that have been in place for centuries, our political systems, our cultural norms, all of that, subject to change eventually and evolving. But how many generations is it going to take? And so far, it's taken really four generations of great amount of effort by people, again, trying to use education in some form or other as a way to change the way people think about how the world works. And so that's sort of the framework what I'd like to get you to think about. Now, in my own case, my involvement in education in the Georgist community started in 1980 when I attended the Henry George School of Social Science in Philadelphia. And George Collins was my teacher, and I came in with very fixed ideas of how the world worked. And it took me a long time, I was fairly stubborn, a long time to really begin to see that Henry George had a very different perspective, and one that I had never encountered. And eventually started to think seriously about, and then study, and then go on over the course of, well, now it's been since 1981, to teach again and again and again to probably thousands of people over those years, at least several thousands of people. And I continue to do that. How effective have I been? I can't really point to very many people who are involved with the Georgist movement in any serious way from my teaching. All I can hope is that people who I have touched have in fact embraced a different perspective about the world, and maybe if they had the opportunity to vote, if there was a piece of legislation that came up, or a candidate that said, I'm in favor of collecting the rental value of land, or ending land monopoly, that they would say, hey, that's a candidate that I could maybe support. So with that, my brief introduction, I'd like to turn it over to Mike and ask Mike to tell you, because many of you, I'm sure, don't know the diversity of what he's done in the classroom and other ways of teaching, and give you a sense of the level of effort that he's put in, and he can describe what he thinks he's accomplished or learned during this whole process. Mike?
Thank you, sir. Well, I have to say, based on what Ed just revealed here, it was my mother who ran into George Collins and Lou Cipollone at the Arden Fair. And I had been elected a couple of years before to the Board of Assessors in Arden, and realized I had no idea. Had enormous trouble struggling through Progress and Poverty on my own. A lot of you might know I'm a high school dropout, but somehow I did, as Ed, only this was in 1970, went to the school in Philadelphia and started recruiting classes in Arden, and did that for 10 years, and went to the prisons for another 10 years, as well as Arden. And I guess after about 20 years, I got George Collins' job in Philadelphia when he went to New York. And then after 12 years, I went to New York for 3 years, and then I retired. And after I got back to Arden, I kept on doing the classes in Arden. And in fact, I was known as the Jehovah's Witness of economics. I knocked on doors and recruited people to take my class. Otherwise, I never would have gotten anybody to take the classes. But this last time, which is a few years ago now, I had 27 people finish the course. And none of those people would have signed up and showed up if I had knocked on their door and talked them into it. So that's it. Well, when Ed asked me to talk about Georgist Education, I tried to put something together, and I thought, well, Georgist Education really is different because we're not teaching just to expand the general level of knowledge and productivity. We're trying to teach something that people have to know in order to bring about a just and prosperous society, which in a way is what Ed just got done saying. But that's our ultimate goal. And so whether it's the need for jobs, stagnant wages, unaffordable cost of housing and healthcare, inflation that robs everybody of their savings and reduces their wages in terms of what they can buy, or even the fact that all the investment in public education has not reduced the level of poverty. We must show that the root cause of the problem is the institution of private property in land. And we must show how land is different from things that are produced, and how its value is created by the community, and how private property and land and the hoarding that it engenders causes unemployment and wages that tend to remain stagnant, as well as recessions and depressions. And by collecting the rental value of land for public purpose, we would create full employment and affordable housing, raise wages in sync with the march of inventions, and use the socially created values to pay for social programs like national health care, which is in the news now, and Social Security. But you can't be a Georgist. You can't be for the Georgist remedy if you don't understand and agree with the thesis. So that's our mission, is the education of it. And as Ed showed in that slide presentation, which I want to commend him for, that was really good, Ed. Really.
Thanks, Mike.
Excellent, outstanding. At one point, it's alleged at least that the Henry George School in New York had 90 classes a week at all, I don't know how many different locations in the city and around the country, Philadelphia being one of them. And they were all taught by volunteers. So of course, our question now is, why is it so hard to get people to take the classes? And why is it so hard to get those who have taken the courses and agree with the thesis to share it with others? They could write letters to the editor. They could write letters to their elected representatives, invite friends and teach a class in their house, set up a class at the library, or teach at the Osher Lifelong Learning Institute. And my answer is that they do not believe it has any chance of being adopted within their lifetime. It isn't that they don't see the merit of it. I think a lot of people don't have the self-confidence to believe that it's right at first. And excuse me, until they get through maybe that first course, or even sometimes the second or third. Excuse me. But I think the biggest reason they don't advocate it is because they don't think it has a chance. And you ask yourself, why would anyone give up friends and their standing in the community and be looked at as a communist or an incendiary when there is no chance of generating even a following, let alone the legislation we seek?
Mike?
Of course, that could change. Just need another half a minute.
Mike, let me interrupt you for a second
Yeah.
and ask you a question.
Okay.
What does that say about us?
Well, that we don't quit easy. We don't give up. And of course, there's probably a lot of psychological reasons why we don't. Maybe we got nothing. We got no other life except this. This is who we are. But nonetheless, we keep thinking that it might change, and if it does, we'll be there. We'll be the pilot light out of which the movement can start to bloom. And I think we have to believe that it could change at any moment. And otherwise, we wouldn't be working for it either. There's many methods of getting our ideas across. Some use the Socratic method, some use models, some use parables, and many combinations of those three things. And all of them are good. I believe that there are really only two things that are necessary for a successful class in political economy. One, that the students believe they're learning something of interest to them, which is pretty hard. And two, that you have a sincere desire for them to learn, to understand the material, rather than impressing them with how much you know, which we've all seen lots of Georgists do. And to just finish, if the student hasn't learned, I don't care how smart you are and how much you know, the teacher hasn't taught. That's it.
Well, great, Mike. That's a great summary of your feelings about it. I have one before I ask Bret to talk about his experience. I have one final question, and that is the diversity of students you've had, particularly the people that have been incarcerated. I mean, that have had probably the worst experiences in life. You know, how difficult was it to relate to them? And
well, you got to remember, I can relate to them pretty well because I have the same level of education they do. And but I don't have the same life experience they have. And I think that they have nothing invested in the system as it is. Most of them don't own any land, although
right.
Occasionally someone does, and they are quite invested in rationalizing why it should be private property. But I think most of them don't. And they haven't, besides not having any land, they don't expect that they're going to get some. The way most people in the white middle class community, they really do have a chance of getting ahead, even though all of us won't. They have a chance. But I think a lot of the black guys in prison realize that their chances are not that good. And so I think that's why they're much more partial to this, rather than seeing that it is a game of musical chairs, and well, all I got to do is win, is be faster than the others. I think they see that it is a good thing to.
You raise an interesting point.
Now, one of the things that I thought I might mention is in the first, let's say the first 10 or so years that I was in this movement, I recruited a lot of teachers I think about 10 of them, like Artie Yetman and Don Herford and so on, and finally Lindy Davies. And in the last 5 or 10 years, I hardly recruited anybody to teach. And I think the better I got as a presenter, the worse I got at inspiring others to teach. And part of it could easily be that thing where I fell into trying to impress people with how much I knew, as opposed to really inspire them to understand this stuff and to be able to pass it on. So who knows about that in my own case, but I feel like that's an important factor.
Well, you've raised a number of issues that I think during the discussion might generate some questions, certainly. But with regard to your last point, my experience was over time, our students were less and less likely to read the book and do the lessons in the classroom. And so you have to abandon the Socratic method of teaching in that environment. You have no choice but to move to a lecture discussion format. And
well, I don't quite agree with that, but I understand your point. I think it's well taken. I think that you're right about they aren't going to read the book, but it doesn't mean you can't use the Socratic method, but you can't relate to the book. You have to relate to their own life experience. And that's all.
Okay.
Not to disagree with you, but just to.
No, it's a different way to approach. I'm thinking of
that to use the Socratic method because I knew they weren't going to read the book, so I tried not to relate too close to the book. But there's a lot of good stuff in that book, parables and so on that people can relate to. I mean, the man was pretty good at analogy.
Well, you found a way to use the technique that it never occurred to me to simply ask questions of people without them having read anything to provide, responses to.
Well, I was going to say, early on when I came in, you mentioned Pollard and his 50,000. When I first met him, it was a 75,000, and he said we quit counting at 75, but he was pretty good at setting up situations and then having people role play. And so
well, that's a perfect introduction to Bret Barker.
There you go.
Who was one of the people early on, and Bret, I know this takes us back quite a few decades, who encountered Harry Pollard and was influenced by his message and picked up the ball and ran with it. So, Bret, maybe a good place to start in your talk would be to tell us a little bit about your early introduction to the inter-student program through Harry and how that affected you as a teacher. You have to unmute yourself, Bret. Bret, you're muted. You have to unmute yourself. How you doing?
I'm doing well. I'm just grading some papers right now. I went to college and I came out a Marxist. And my first few years of teaching was a combination of what they called opportunity room. These were the roughest kids, because I was about ready to go into the sheriff's academy. And I don't know, somebody thought I was a good disciplinarian or something. They offered me these rough kids. So that was my first couple of years. But I taught the middle school kids at the beginning. And then I moved up to the high school. And I was very frustrated at the beginning because, now I'm not disagreeing with you, Ed, at all about lecture. I think there's an appropriate place for it. It's still the common way that most teachers probably deliver. But I think as far as my experience with the younger people, you have to really mix that up a lot. There has to be a lot of exchange, a lot of conversation and talk. But anyway, I met Harry about 1987, I figured. That was the year before my daughter was born, at a social studies conference. And I went to this conference because I was so frustrated that I just couldn't understand why the students weren't interested in everything I had to say. So I went to this conference, and there was Harry at a table with Progress in Poverty. He had a little video going. It was showing kids working together. It didn't look like he was really selling things like publications to read, which is what you saw in these floors of these social studies conferences. I just walked over to him and I asked him, what are you selling? He says, I'm not selling anything. I'm selling a method. There's no charge. And our friendship developed from there. Once I started his ideas in the classroom, I found that they worked for me, that they were very effective. So it wasn't very long after using the basic technique with these kids that
Can you elaborate on that so everyone understands?
Many people numbers that Mike talked about, the 50,000 to 70,000, those are based on his number of teachers that he had working with him at the middle school level going back to 1970, because he developed the interstudent idea of trying to get the young kids to deal with basic economic concepts in a little simple 4-page discussion, which a teacher could introduce at any time. So it was an idea that maybe the teacher would like a relief from traditional ways of doing things for a while, and maybe would try out one of these little minis, as he called them. And there were 8 or 9 of them that eventually became the Interstudent Economics program. I used to use those with the kids when I was at Shear High School as a young teacher teaching world history. Kids ate it up, they loved it. They got them to think. We got them to get up there and argue about things. And it wasn't the only materials we used. We used the standard textbook, to teach history. These materials were an economic analysis or classical analysis. What did Harry call it then? Classical analysis.
Yeah.
Classical analysis. And he kept egging me on to try to teach economics. I actually was a history major, and I was a little intimidated to teach that subject. So we did his adult course that's a Socratic in nature. It's essentially spoon-feeding people, an idea and going through a series of questions. But the basic importance of it is trying to get people to talk, to read a little bit in advance, if they will, and if not, get them to read on the spot and read it aloud if necessary. Questions, and it's all Socratic throughout. You might say it's kind of leading the student along the path, spoonful at a time. So anyway, he egged me on to try to teach economics, and I says, well, what materials would I use? He says, well, how about I retool the courses that I designed for the intermediate level, and we kick it up a notch, add more things that would make it a more all-embracing course in economics. So what came out of that after many, many years and additions was the Interstudent Economics, basically about an 18-week course, which is a semester in economics, which any teacher could try and use along with their textbooks and lecture all they want if they thought that was effective. So that's kind of how I got into this. And I gave a faculty presentation early on when people saw that I had kids working in groups. And at that point, cooperative learning goes by another word now. Cooperative learning, the teacher as monitor, they have different names for it, was new. And so I got attacked by colleagues. And by the way, I ended up teaching at the same high school I graduated from. So when I was a young guy, there were a lot of my former teachers there that were watching what I was doing. And so they said, why don't you get up one morning in front of the staff or one of our staff meetings and tell them what you're doing? And I got these stony faces, like, you can't do that. That's not teaching. That's not education. You should have these kids sitting in rows all the time, and they should be taking notes on everything you say. And that was how they were taught. So the idea of trying to get kids to try to teach themselves a little bit, with a teacher being sort of a monitor and cross-examining their questioning and quizzing them every day and trying to hold them accountable for a small body of information each night, that was just wasn't tried. So I continued to use it, and I've been fortunate over the years to get a few other teachers to try it. But that's my biggest failure. I can't get enough teachers to try it. They're just intimidated by it. Harry and I, years ago, we went to these teachers' conferences, and you'd get people all excited about it because Harry would have a way of waving his arms and getting people real excited about things. And they would come up afterwards, they say, this sounds great. And they'd put their name on a piece of paper and you would send them materials, but then you'd never hear from them. So that's the frustrating thing, is you need teachers to want to teach it. I had one thought earlier, and that was that I don't think you make Georgists as much as you find them.
Yeah.
I think you find people that know there's something wrong out there. And if you can connect with those young people, those teachers, whomever, then you got somebody who's going to become a Georgist. But reading Progress and Poverty alone, we used to have essay contests where they would read it and write. And I even remember one of the kids who did pretty well in the essay contest later went on to work for Goldman Sachs. And he went on to talk to me one day and he says, you know, Mr. Barker, those Henry George ideas are never going to come about. I said, well, what makes you think so? And he says, I just don't think. And by the way, up at Berkeley, I learned about Keynes. And so I think, you know, Keynes just makes more sense than Henry George's ideas. He says, well, I tried to plant a seed in your head. Maybe you'll think about him again someday. So you don't know what young people are going to end up doing when they go through high school and what kind of life experience they have. But I agree with Ed. If the society ultimately is saturated with the idea of collecting rent, then there will be enough people out there who will vote for it. But not until it's so widespread in the public mind that it becomes obvious it's the thing that we should do. I always tell
this is, you've hit what I think is an extremely important point, and that is, and I tried to make this clear in the video that I prepared on our history of trying to do this. Even at the peak of the Henry George movement and its educational activity, it was still reaching only a very small percentage of the total population of any country. And in some countries, it reached a small group, you know, a couple dozen people. And here we are, you know, it's more than a century later, and we're still struggling to get the world to pay attention to what we think, most of us think, is the greatest insights into human civilization that anyone's ever encountered. And Henry George stood on the shoulders of others who had those insights, but he was extremely effective. But even his effectiveness wasn't effective enough to change the course of history. Although in reading what George wrote toward the end of his life, he felt like he had done all he could. And that the world, that because of those efforts, that we were at a point where he didn't think that his presence was any longer really necessary. That now the momentum had been built up, but forces were certainly at work in the opposite direction. And in the video, I make the point, at least from my perspective, and we can now open this up for anyone who has comments or questions and share your own experiences. But certainly ask Mike and Bret questions about what they've talked about. It's my sense, and it relates to even what Harry Pollard has said over and over again, you know, to me, and that is, if we'd only stuck to the course, have done what, you know, he was working on in terms of his approach to adults, if we'd only continued that approach, that we would have had much more success. My feeling is that the timing had reached the end of the course of the typical not for credit Henry George courses taught in the Henry George schools or elsewhere, because after the Second World War, the whole employment environment had changed. Number one was a shift to credentials, college graduates, training schools. If you didn't have a college degree, your opportunities were very much reduced. And the proliferation of community colleges. So almost anyone could get at least a 2-year degree for very low cost. What did the Henry George movement have in competition to that? You know, it had to wait for, you know, people who either weren't pursuing a college degree, or some of us who had already earned our credentials, but we were still, you know, very much unconvinced that we had learned much in our formal schooling. We're looking for answers to these questions. But I think that was a major cause for the downfall of the effectiveness of the Henry George School of, number one, recruiting students and then turning those students into teachers. So we'll open it up now. Any comments or questions that you would like to make? Raise your hand and Sue will unmute you. Looks like Alan, Ridley, and Sue have their hands up, Sue.
Okay, let's do Alan first. All right, I can get it. Oops, hold
All of
on.
your commentaries and experiences. And Bret and I have worked together on essay contests, and we tried, and I think we mostly failed. I think we gave one guy, was it $2,000 or something, a ridiculous amount of money, and then he took the money and we never heard from him again. So we don't do a good job of follow-up. But the point I wanted to ask about is Floyd Morrow really believed in, you have to have something physical to show what you're really talking about. I mean, it's easy to just go on and on, you know, a talking head, but it's really hard to have a physical example of what you're talking about. And people will respond to that. Floyd Morrow had a 19-unit complex that he called the Henry George Center. And we had designs to change the name of the street to the Henry George Way, but we didn't get that far. And then he had two low-power TV stations, which he won in a lottery with the FCC. And then he also has a radio station that's still broadcasting today, KNSJ FM 91 in San Diego. Pretty powerful stuff. But what about, isn't it helpful to have something physical that you can say, or yeah, I think Fairhope and Arden have a lot of that. They can say, we have a community right here. It works really beautifully. And
just hold it right there, Alan.
Sure.
I could talk about Arden quite a bit, but there really is no hope for Arden creating Georgists. I can tell you that after 50 years of doing it.
Well, there is
Fairhope
this.
would be the same argument.
Now, most of you know that I spent my career in the financial services industry, and the last 20 years before I retired, I was at Fannie Mae, and you know that corporate giant operated to try to influence public policy in many ways, and also tried to influence how players in the affordable housing sector operated. And so we always talked about best practices. And so I think what Alan, you might be alluding to is the need to have best practices as an example to show people. No matter whether you call that something physical, I don't know. But it's really tough for us, as Mike said. Arden has never operated as a best practice probably since after the first decade of its existence. Yeah. Would you say, Mike?
And the first decade was an utter failure. So
so then you have Fairhope, which is a very successful community, but its adherence to the basic principles that the founders embraced, those have been diluted considerably. And there are all sorts of utopian communities, not just created by Georgist, but by many others that have gone by the wayside.
Sue Hunsel's next.
And I just ended up with, there is a movement now in the United States, and maybe some of you are familiar with it. It's the co-housing movement. And I've often thought that was an example that would be very attracted to the Georgist idea. But in my working career, trying to talk to those folks, they weren't interested in common ownership of land per se. Very difficult for us. People have been educated in a certain way. Bret gets them early. He has the best chance of I guess what you call nurturing their minds to think differently. But even then, Bret, as you've indicated, you know, kids grow up, they leave and they go on, and they're influenced by other more powerful forces.
Yeah, very few actually do it. I mean, it's never-ending frustration. Why don't more kids see the cat at the end of the year? They sort of get it. They get bits and pieces of it, but they're teenagers. I mean, they're developing. They got a lot of other priorities. A lot of kids, it's just, I just want to pass. But every year, there's a few who follow the discussion, and they understand it. But again, what are they going to do with it?
Well, you have had experience with a couple of your past students going on to college and becoming teachers and contacting you, have you not?
Oh, yeah. Yeah, but they don't all necessarily go into economics.
No.
They don't, yeah. And what subject they end up teaching is going to dictate whether they can discuss this kind of stuff. If they end up being a science teacher.
Sue, you were...
Yeah,
wanted-
I was, and I'm still here. So I don't know, the brief period of time I did in-person teaching through the offshoot of the, the School of Economic Science, the Canadian outfit that's related to them. People were nodding their heads and saying, oh, this is so great. But they thought it was kind of a pie in the sky thing. My other observation that's not related that much is that it kind of breaks my heart to see the progressives, the young people who are, fighting for, healthcare in the US, better healthcare in Canada, better relief for COVID, better seniors homes, all this stuff. The only options they have is the ultra conservative neoliberal side, which they totally reject, and some kind of, I don't know,
State socialism.
Roosevelt, no, it's not state socialism. It's just a mixed economy like they have in Sweden. It's not terribly socialist, but it's, regulating pollution and things like that. And it breaks my heart that they just don't see, the middle way, or the way that, makes a lot of problems solve themselves. So you don't need a ton of government intervention. And the same with the permaculture people. It's the perfect fit for permaculture, because permaculture restores land. The land they'd be doing it on would be very, very cheap. It's fairly barren land that's hard to farm. So I'm just wondering if anybody has any insights about talking
Reaching.
millennial age progressives, or how to get them on board, realize, there is an actual fix for this stuff. There isn't the government doing everything.
I'd like to say about Sue, who's been working with Izzy Gleaner's son, and she's gotten him through the first course. You get him through further?
No.
And she's been
Well,
working.
I haven't, like those courses need way more work. Like the quiz, the study questions aren't even on the site for some of them. So, yeah.
What Sue's referring to is the courses that are offered through the Henry George Institute. And, we were all, those of us who know the Institute, we were very dependent upon Lindy Davies as the glue to make sure that all that mechanics worked. And without Lindy, the Institute is working, those of us who are on its board and volunteers, Sue included, are working as best we can to try to see that the Institute survives. And it's more difficult than one would imagine.
And our webmaster happens to think, whoa, he's not a Georgist, but he's going, which way did he go? He finds one hole and then it gets stopped and then he has to come back. He talks to Sue and I and think, which way do you go? So be patient. This is a work in progress.
And we're, what I tried to do with the video, at least as it covered more, current activities, that almost everyone who's involved still in the movement is doing some sort of education, whether it's classroom education, whether it's internet activity, whether it's Facebook, trying to talk to politicians about legislation, doing research and studies. It all involves education, and activism merge often, and sometimes you really don't, it's not easy to know the difference. And what we're all trying to be is effective, and searching for ways to be more and more effective, to reach people and get them to think and change their perspective if they have one. And I can only say from my own personal experience, I haven't found any answers to those questions. I continue to try, as Mike does and as Bret does in the classroom, and Sue and many others on this call. I mean, there are people involved in the academic community. Mason Gaffney spent his whole career trying to teach it. Fred Falvari is doing that now. Polly Cleveland continues to do it. Many others have tried to do it through formal education, and there are encouraging signs, but changing the course of history, using our educational tools. Does anyone have any thoughts on how we can be more effective based on what you've learned from others?
Can I say something about this Prager University idea that we talked about?
Yeah, sure.
I have my students every once in a while, go fish around on the internet for something I want them to listen to. And some of the themes in Prager University are interesting, especially the way they put it together. These are 5-minute talks by people who are authors, politicians, economists, scientists. Now, it's a conservative website, no doubt. But the way it's put together, I kept thinking the last few years, it would be great if the Henry George movement, somehow or other, could finance something like this. If you've never seen PragerU, pick a course. Like, for example, he had one yesterday posted about Memorial Day. And what I like about it is it grabs your attention for a few minutes and gets you to think about something that maybe isn't commonly accepted.
Well, my response to that, Bret,
Yeah.
we lost you for a second, I think.
Yeah, it isn't a long, drawn-out discussion. But if it were to work with Georgist philosophy, it would have to be broken down into segments and spoon-fed to people almost. If it were interesting, then people would watch more.
Yeah. Well, this is the challenge. I've looked at the Prager University stuff, and I've been very impressed with its professionalism. The big difference, it seems to me, between what they're able to do and what we're able to do is that they have a natural constituency. There's some percentage of the population in the United States that accepts almost without serious question the values that Prager University is proposing. And on the other side, I spend a lot of time these days looking at the left's activism and education, particularly videos by Democracy Now! and by Richard Wolff, who is a Marxist economist who teaches now at the New School, but has an enormous following. His videos will get on average 500,000 views.
And he doesn't know the law of rent, does he?
Well, he has said, well, he does know the law of rent, though he doesn't talk about it very much, because his Richard Wolff's basic philosophy is to sell a form of democratic socialism based on cooperative enterprise. So if you listen to Richard Wolff, he says, yes, I've studied Karl Marx and I believe in socialism, but no one has really understood what socialism really means in the past. And he's trying to explain, why state socialism that exists in China and existed in the Soviet Union was not really the kind of socialism that even Karl Marx was advocating.
Right.
So, but my point about both of those is they have a really strong, sizable constituency of people who already accept their basic principles.
I don't know that. Could be right.
Brendan is next, and then Warren Chamberlain. So Brendan Hennigan, you're next. And I've tried to unmute you and I can't.
You must unmute yourself, Brendan.
The phone is ringing. I've got to let it just click into the answer machine. Thanks a lot, Ed. Thanks for that presentation online on YouTube. My answer machine has just gone on, so I hope you can hear me okay. So Ed, thank you very much, and Bret, great to see you, and thanks for your comments and also your comments, Mike. I would like to sort of move into the present, because what I'm hearing up here in Canada, and I imagine you're hearing it on the street in the US, is people are saying things aren't going to be the same. Now, nobody knows how different it's going to be after the lockdown. But do you see any potential in the present situation? Do we just keep on trying to do better what we've done in the past, or do you just see any new opportunities with the present economic lockdown? And some people are very worried about the consequences of that.
Who are you asking?
Well, I'll ask Bret.
Well, I had my students read a few articles where they, I try to get them to weigh the costs and the benefits idea. And we might have reduced exposure to COVID-19, but the costs are unemployment, suicide, increased drug addiction. I don't know how you can weigh these hard things in the balance, but I try to get the kids to say, well, was it necessarily the best approach that they used to try to prevent the spread of this virus, if that's what you're asking me? Is that what you're asking me, or are you asking
people are saying in the next 6 months, all our governments will be facing really tough decisions about who's going to pay for the rescue packages that they have. And as Georgists, we would say, well, you get that through a change in the tax system, through land and rent and land values, etc. Do you think there's an opportunity, an economic opportunity, not just to do with the health, but because our financial system could be changing, and at the moment we don't know what that change could be? And on educational, how do you get that? How would you recommend getting that message out to the different groups?
Well, as it turns out, I'm not sure. My experience as a lending officer and then as a market analyst in finance always put me to the one issue: how much debt can people reasonably carry before they bring on a disaster to themselves? And then as a society, how much aggregate debt can we carry? And it seems to me that what we're faced with now is such an unprecedented level of debt. Even before the pandemic occurred, if you looked at the statistics, and I used these to teach a course back last fall, it was really pretty scary to look at the trend in delinquencies on credit cards, on automobile loans, the fact that more and more automobile loans were of the subprime character, student loan debt. And what people don't really pay attention to is the extent to which the student loan debt is carried by senior citizens, by retired people who are paying for the education, not just for themselves, but mostly for their kids and grandchildren. The number of people who took out reverse mortgage loans to meet their ongoing expenses. Well, maybe Polly, who's on, can offer some comment on this as well. But it seems to me that we're now at the point where we've put so much spending power into the economy to try to replace lost income. And the question is, how much of that new spending power is being used to keep people from defaulting on debt? And if that's not enough, then we're going to have a chain of defaults in terms of debt that will require a massive change in our bankruptcy laws and evictions from housing, all of that. Do we have the political will to do that? And then in the longer term, my fear is that even if we manage to get through that period somehow, then the threat of hyperinflation is what will follow. So, Polly, would you care to criticize me or offer your own insights? You're on mute. You have to unmute yourself.
Maybe she doesn't want to.
I put her on the spot, did I not?
Oh, boy. I am not really concerned about hyperinflation. I think we're more likely to have deflation because, you know, with just the collapse of incomes, there's no purchasing power out there. And in general, when you have a downturn, the demand collapses more than supply. You know, we've had episodes of hyperinflation or heavy inflation, you know, when OPEC took off and suddenly cut the world supply of oil, but usually when you have a crash, you have deflation because credit gets cut off round the lot and people can't pay rent, they can't pay anything, and they stop buying while the supply is still there, even if it, you know, takes a while to adjust. Supply adjusts more slowly than demand. Demand is often affected instantly by credit. That's one way to put it. So I'm not concerned about hyperinflation. I am concerned about riots in the streets. You know, the way we're going, the 0.0001% is going to own most of everything, and I don't think that's a politically tolerable situation. How we're going to deal with it going forward, I have no idea. Either we're going to have a democratic revolution or we're going to return to another feudal system.
Brandon, what do you think about that?
Well, thank you for the optimism. No, I think Polly is right. There's so many unknowns at the present time. And deflation, I agree with you. I don't see people talking about hyperinflation just because there's so much cheap money. Interest rates well below historically for the last 10 years, well below historical levels. And we'll just have to see how it plays out. One of the worries is that if an economy goes bad, do you get social unrest? And that's the unknowns that you can't really predict, you know, and how that will morph. But as we know, that the centers that will get really hard hit are the poor centers, the marginalized communities, the inner cities, you know, and those are people that I worry about.
Well, what should our message be? I mean, to the extent that we can reach the public, I mean, we have people on Facebook. We have, you know, our friends at the Henry George School and the Schachenbach Foundation, Land and Liberty, you know, other publications. Our Australian colleagues seem, from my perspective, to be the most successful at reaching beyond their, you know, their own community to affect the thinking of the larger public arena. I don't know what their reason is why Australians are different, but it seems the work that Carl Fitzgerald and the people at Prosper Australia have done are making an inroad with getting people to think very differently and about, you know, how government should raise its revenue and maybe respond to the pandemic and its economic consequences. But I don't, you know, anyone have any thoughts on that?
Victor here.
One thing you could take Alan's thing about something concrete some of the cities in Australia do have a land value tax that is known, and so they can play on that. And I'd say, in the same thought as Alan was presenting, Harrisburg, and maybe there's a couple of other of those 20 cities that are worth stating the statistics. There's a concrete example of a partial application.
Victor here from Allentown, Pennsylvania.
Hello, Victor. Welcome.
The solution is in the Constitution. This is not an economic question. I've spoken with Marty Rowland at the Left Forum a couple of times, and the common issue is agrarian justice. Henry George and Thomas Paine agreed on agrarian justice. If you want to deliver a powerful message, check out the music of David Rovics, R-O-V-I-C-S. It's on YouTube. One of his songs is Landlord. Another one is Age of the Robber Barons. The young people know who he is. You're not going to hear him on corporate media, though.
How do you spell his last name?
R-O-V-I-C-S. With Veterans for Peace, we invited him to Allentown, and his music is very powerful. And I'm giving you two examples that pertain to Henry George. This is not an economic issue. It's a sociological, political economy, sociological issue. The key question that we should be asking is, who gave them the right? Who gave the rentiers the right to do what they're doing? It is fundamentally against the U.S. Constitution to have corporations robbing the American people. It's a matter of restoring the 14th Amendment, equal protection of the law. But this is a topic for a much longer discussion. I would just urge getting a bigger structure, getting a structure based on, well, for example, the Unitarian Church. I'm a deist. Thomas Paine was a deist. In Collegeville, Pennsylvania, there's a Thomas Paine Fellowship UUC Church. That's one structure that might be helpful. I'm also a member of the National Writers Union. The union structure might be helpful. Teachers who are sympathetic. But if we aim at getting a representative in every congressional district, that would be a good start. If we can start with a structure, and the counties are not a good structure. Counties are fundamentally un-American. They are a British structure. So we should go with the congressional districts and the state representatives because they're more or less equal.
Victor, what do you mean by getting a representative in every congressional district? Getting someone elected?
No, well, obviously, eventually, but I've talked to this with the National Writers Union because they have some funding that might do this. Maybe getting a writer in each congressional district to spread the idea of equal protection of the law, and maybe giving him a stipend, some token amount. Doesn't have to be a writer. The point is that unless you have a structure, anybody will invent anything, and it'll just be, people talking about different, whatever they want to talk about. Henry George's idea is fundamentally about injustice. And the solution is restoring common sense and justice. And the hero, you're my president, I'm your vice president. Thomas Paine's common sense, I think, is part of the solution.
Yeah. What Victor's referring to is that we're both members of Thomas Paine's Friends, and I'm the sitting president, and he's a vice president of that organization. And there's so much common thread between the writings of Paine and George. I was a follower of Thomas Paine long before I ever heard of Henry George. But as soon as I read Henry George, it just was cemented in my brain that, my gosh, this is, I described it as George picked up the torch that had fallen to the ground and almost burned out when Thomas Paine died. And it had sat there on the ground for a very, very long time, waiting for someone with the same sort of inspiration to pick it up. There is a growing level of interest among people generally in Paine, and to some degree in George as well. How do we capitalize on that and get people to begin to be more activist in terms of of trying to help educate others about the wisdom of these two great, thinkers is really a major challenge. But it's part of the MOST system that John Berger told us about. So
Warren has his hand up.
yes.
Yes, hi. Glad to see you all. For some of you who don't know who I am, I've been at the CGO conference. Last time was at Harrisburg. I haven't been able to go since then. I live in Boston. I live in the west suburban part of Boston. I'm a good friend of Dan Sullivan, and I'm also interested in monetary reform and banking, and I see the connection with the issue of money as debt and credit, how that affects land values and prices going up. I'm very active on Facebook, but one of the things that I've come up with, and this is my 15th. I was elected on my town planning board 15 years ago, 3 5-year terms. And during that time, I tried to really work at the municipal level and talking to the people on my planning board, people on the Board of Assessors, my selectmen. I've also served with the Metropolitan Area Planning Council regional group for my town, which it takes about 5 or 6 towns in our area that have a member that's a member of the planning board, a member of the select board, who meet once a month. I'm very close friends with my state legislator, Carolyn Dykema, and also my state senator, who actually now Karen Spilka, who is now the Senate president of our Senate in Massachusetts. Over this time, I've always concerned, one of the things I'm concerned with was homelessness and the affordability, housing affordability, and recognizing that it obviously is the cost of land that is the biggest factor. And part of the big factor in that has to do with zoning. And my town has single family zoning. And I have a ½ acre of land and a 6-room house. This could have duplexes on it. We could, in this subdivision, could have twice as many houses and people in it. But zoning and taxing. So property taxes are a big issue. Everybody hates property taxes. So it's hard to separate people to understand the difference between, well, we'll stop taxing a house and we'll just tax the land. It just so happens, my house is now, the market value of my house is now around $400,000. It's a
Let me correct you, Warren. The market value of your property is $400,000.
Yeah, sorry, thank you for the property total. Yeah, the total parcel value.
The real estate.
Is that. Now, of that, you break it down. We do break it down in our town, how much they assess the land for and how much they assess the house for. And every year, the land keeps going up and going up. The houses depreciate, of course. So when people are getting, all of a sudden, they're realizing, my taxes went up this year because the land value went up tremendously the last 2 or 3 years. As they do every 3 years, every year they do 1/3 of the houses over and over. So this year suddenly it was a shock to the system. But one of the things is that I realized that when Henry George was at his height, land was more monopolized by a small minority of the people, possibly farmers, possibly old plantation owners and such. And so there were probably a lot more people who didn't own property. They were tenants or tenant farmers or something. And I think what happened to change is after World War II and the advent of the progressive income tax and withholding and the advent of the Veterans Bill, GI Bill, and Federal Housing Administration and so forth, we were able to subsidize people to now become homeowners. The American dream was that you too can be a homeowner. So now 63%, and that could change in another couple of months, if people go bankrupt and they can't make their payments. If you have 63% of the population who own their own homes, in a suburban town like I live in, 100% of the residents in this town own their own home. A few tenants. We don't have very many apartments or anything like that. So the people that I find on the Facebook and everything that are that are fans of Henry George are usually tenants, or they're homeless, or they don't own property. And they would like to, and they see how this would help them do that. But the average person here in my town, and I'm right in there, I'm part of the enemy. I'm the landlord now, and I own this little chunk, my little, it's a privilege that I own this little piece in this wonderful little town that everybody wants to live in, but can't afford to. I got grandfathered in here 50 years ago. But, so the thing is, if we were to make a change, I propose this to the people on the planning board, my good Bret friend down the street, she's board of assessors on 3 years, she's being re-elected this year. I've had a chance to talk to people who are right in the control of local town government. And there's no appetite for this. They understand in principle how it would work, but politically, you're not going to get 63% of the people in town. We have to have, like 2/3 majority vote to change zoning. And tax changes would be even more difficult because it'd be hard. So people are afraid of, they just don't understand,
Warren, I think we all probably sympathize or empathize with what you've gone through. I mean, many of us have tried to educate our local officials and members of our community and come up against the same sort of experience. I think Brendan's question probably is one that's really relevant right now, and that is with the pandemic and with the decline in the economy to such a level, rising unemployment and certainly the potential collapse in property values, does that open the door for the Georgist perspective?
Well, if you
maybe you could, do you think so?
More people in distress, more people get bankrupt, more people lose their homes. That percentage of the ownership class and the homeless and the dispossessed, that majority is going to shift. There's going to be a greater desire for the reform, and they're going to be looking for different reforms that might work. Whether it's socialism, whether it's Bernie Sanders, there is that groundswell there, that there's a political constituency out there. That's the group that needs to be consider it and see how this tax can actually function, how it will actually shift the way we own and use property, and change, and other things have to change. You have to change our monetary system has to change, our zoning laws have to change, and yes, get money out of politics. That's another one. Get onto that bandwagon with the 28th Amendment. Corporations are not people, and money is not speech. Because then we get money out of politics, nothing's going to change.
These are not issues that are driven by Georgists per se. I mean, they're issues that we have a stake in for sure. So how much, what kind of alliances can we form as individuals and even as small groups? For example, on the political side of our movement is Common Ground USA, which has a few chapters around the country. And probably the most effective ones right now are in Minnesota and in Washington, Oregon. But, we would need Common Ground chapters in every major city in the United States to have any real impact on what happens in terms of national policy. But I don't know what we should do, except keep trying. I think Sue said that Victor wanted to enter, and then I see Alan's hand up. Go ahead, Warren.
I just wanted to say, you guys are asking questions. What can we do different? And I'm trying to offer you some insights and suggestions.
Okay.
And you say, well, we can only do this, we can only do that. It's a much bigger thing than Henry George. Henry George pointed out the fundamental injustice of being able to monopolize our natural resource base, land and everything else. And then we've been able to export that and make us suburbanites, we're hoarding the land too and depriving other people of their ability to live and have a decency. And this has also taken away, robbed farmers, and we've lost how much acres of farmland. And it is based on the fundamental principle of the land is a privilege, and that everybody has to understand that what I own here is a privilege to be here in this town. And I don't have a right to this property. I have a right to my house, but I can't move it so easily. So the point is, we have to help people understand the fundamental difference between a right and a privilege.
Amen.
That's
Okay,
about,
We agree.
let me, by the way, on the participant page, there's a way to raise your hand on that page. The key point is we're burying the lead. Jimmy Carter in 2014 said we're an oligarchy. We're an oligarchy. And there's economic proof of that. So the first step in a solution is to restore democracy. And to do that, you have to remove the criminal class. This is not rocket scientists. We're dealing with criminals on top of the pyramid. So whatever you're dreaming about, economically or socially, it's not going to happen as long as the criminals are in power. Oligarchs. Now, it's not me saying that. That's Jimmy Carter. And
I'd like to try to answer two of Ed's questions. He asked, what should we be saying when we do outreach to people? And also, how do you work with the coronavirus opportunity and danger? And for me, what we need to do is we need to tell people we have solutions, and not only tell them, but we need to demonstrate that we have solutions. And Floyd Morrow was an example of that, because he created this 19-unit complex out of an area where there were, I think, maybe 5 units. And he created an ocean view and didn't block anybody else's ocean view. And we need more demonstrations of what we're talking about. Otherwise, you're just talking heads. We need to have accomplishments and achievements, and we need to have smart goals. That's my 2 cents worth. And also, I think we can partner with a lot of different organizations, like the Masons. We're connected. Our offices are at a Masonic lodge, and also the Waldorf School. Steiner and George, there's an article in one of the old magazines about the connection between George and Rudolf Steiner, who started the Waldorf schools. And so that's the kind of thing. We need to have solutions and demonstrate that our solutions work. And I'm right with you, Warren, on the affordable housing thing. We had our most successful event, our Foundation for Economic Justice was, and Ted attended it. It was, and there was standing room only. It was on ADUs, accessory dwelling units. And it was really quite a successful event. And the state of California reduced some of the barriers to building and putting ADUs on your property. So we need to be practical too, and not just throw everything, say we need to create more Georgists. We don't need the ideologues, we need solutions. We need demonstrations of how things really work. That's my 2 cents worth.
Thanks, Alan. Who's next, Sue? Anyone?
Nobody else?
I think I see Polly's hand up.
Polly, go ahead. Unmute. Let me see if I can unmute her. She's welcome.
There are a group of journalists and activists that I've been very encouraged about, and that we should be talking to. This started with Barry Lynn, who wrote The New Monopoly Capital. He has, well, there are now 2 organizations of activists and journalists pushing for anti-monopoly in various forms. They've certainly got Elizabeth Warren on board, among others. There's Matt Stoller, who just came out with this book, Goliath, and he has a regular column. And he's talking about a return to anti-monopoly as in the era of FDR. Matt Taibbi, of course, David Dayen of The Progressive, Michael Hudson and the whole naked capitalism crowd. In other words, there are a bunch of people, they're not Georgists, though some of them know something about George, but they are thinking very similar things, and they see the similar problems in the monopolization by the 1%. And I've been very pleased to see them emerge, because it's a relief after the Marxists, who I felt really were going nowhere, to see people who have practical solutions and laws in mind, and anti-monopoly. Well, that's close to what we're in favor of. So we should be communicating more with them.
I think all of us have our own constituency or our own network that's, you know, separate from the friends we have and colleagues we have within the Georgist community, and we work at it, you know, those of us who are as deeply committed as many of us are, driven by, you know, trying to make change happen. We keep doing, you know, reaching out in whatever way we can, wherever we can. And it's just, every once in a while you get a crumb thrown, a victory, and it keeps you going. But this is a real challenge. I often say to my wife, you know, the world didn't get this screwed up in a short period of time, and it's going to take a long time for it to turn around. And right now, the big issue for us is whether or not we're going to survive this pandemic. I mean,
And two.
Well, individually, hopefully we're going to survive it, but even as a civilization, you know, I don't know.
You know how Brendan talked about how we could jump on this to take advantage of this? I think we need something like a Georgist Hippocratic Oath. Do no harm. And if you talk to people, now, how are we going to get our economy going again? Let's start thinking about the kind of things we do now that causes harm, and try to subtract those out of the equation so we might be able to recover more quickly from this. That's what I'm going to use on my kids tomorrow. I just realized it. I have them reading Fred Foldberry's piece every semester around this time. The one he wrote, The Ultimate Tax Reform. That's a great 4-page piece, and I have 13 questions that they have to answer about that. And do no harm.
Hey, I like it.
Mhm.
Good.
I see Wynn's hand up. Is Wynn? Go ahead.
Yeah. Something that keeps bouncing around in my brain is something that Joe Stiglitz said at a lecture over in Queensland, Australia, in maybe 2013, about the fire sector absorbing 40% of the, I won't get this exactly right, the profits of the productive portions of the economy. And it seems to me, I'm also hearing, I'm hanging out with the Henry George Foundation classes in London on Fridays. And there's talk there about debt cancellation. And I'm thinking that looking at the fire sector, looking at you know, Hertz filed for bankruptcy. Well, there was a private equity firm in there. You know, who's been sucking up all these funds, and maybe they have to take a haircut now. I haven't gotten to reading the newest issue of Land and Liberty, but I know that there are things there on debt cancellation. What are our opportunities in that whole area? I see Alan's holding up a book.
Yes, I think I'm glad you brought that up, because this guy, his name is Scott Smith, and Ted, I gave Ted a copy of this book, which he read and was, I think, pleased with. It's not Henry George, it's not pure Henry George, it's not even Henry George, but it does recognize, here, the title of the book is New Operating System for the American Economy. Instead of paying taxes, you would receive dividends. And his idea is to generate public revenue from that fire segment of the economy, which is now taken up, what you said, 40%. Anyway, it's a much bigger piece of the pie than it was in the past. And it just doesn't make sense to use incomes as the source of public revenue. He says that the amount of and he wants to do a 0.1% payments tax. And he said that would, the payments in the United States amount to $5 quadrillion. That's 5,000 trillion dollars. And if you do just 0.1% of that, you would get $5 trillion a year. So it's an interesting idea, and it acknowledges this tremendous growth of the fire segment of the economy. And I think that we could get somewhere with eliminating or reducing income taxes, which for me has been a low-hanging fruit, and I don't know why the Henry George advocates haven't latched onto that more, because I think it could get a lot more traction with it.
Two things, Alan, and everyone. Before this session ends, I want to appeal to you, those of you who've been in on this discussion, please send me an email with your best ideas, and I'm going to compile them together and share them. And each of us can do something more than what we're doing, differently than what we're doing, that maybe would make us more effective. I've tried just about everything there is to try, and with not able to point to great successes. I will tell you this story, and it's the story of education and activism. I spent 20 years at Fannie Mae. I retired in 2005. Around 2000, a really bright woman became the senior vice president of my division. And we spent a lot of time talking, because I did a lot of research on housing affordability and demographics, and produced studies for my division. And I eventually got around to talking to her about solutions. Well, she actually endorsed me to create a talk on the advantages of land value taxation as it would affect affordable housing. And I put together about an hour-long PowerPoint, and then the company sent me around the country talking to different stakeholder groups. Now, one of the towns that I went to talk was Pittsburgh. Now, Pittsburgh adopted land value taxation in what, 1916 or something?
19.
Okay. Now, Josh Vincent accompanied me on this visit to this stakeholder meeting in Pittsburgh. These were, bankers, community activists, housing affordability people, clergy people, etc. And not one of the people in that room in 2002 knew that Pittsburgh had ever had land value taxation or any version thereof. So no wonder the city council, when the county did a reassessment of property, found it so easy to blame all the problems on land value taxation or the two-rate property tax. And it just astounded me, that you live under that system for so long, and none of the people that I interacted with in Pittsburgh, and Pittsburgh became was part of my territory. So I worked with all sorts of housing groups, and none of them, not one person had any real knowledge of what Pittsburgh had experienced and why it had experienced what it experienced all those years. I don't know what that says about people or about our efforts, except that from a standpoint of implementing land value taxation and keeping it in place, what I've experienced first with Steve Cord and certainly more recent years with Josh Vincent is every year, every time there's a change in the political leadership, you have to go back and resell them on doing the right thing, because their instinct is to do exactly the wrong thing.
Right. We have time for one more question with Warren and things, and then I can stay on for a little bit longer on this call, but we want to try to make these sessions about 90 minutes, and we're coming.
Sure, we'll give Warren the last word.
And I want to make a comment when he's done.
Okay, all right.
To be short, so I don't want to have the last word exactly. The question that the answer was, what problem were you trying to solve? And Henry George said the problem was inequality of distribution of land resources and opportunity on the land for people to work and live off the land. Today, it's gotten confused. When it came up, when we had a progressive income tax that the rich paid for, we were collecting more of the rent that way. Now it's come down, it's flat now. There's no longer a progressive tax. Now that's exacerbating the problem of more income and equity, income and wealth inequality. So that's the fundamental issue. And I think that, Henry George, the ideas are still there, that this is the problem we're trying to solve, is income and opportunity and wealth inequality. And I do believe that the land value tax would fix it, but it won't work if you don't fix some of the other things too, like campaign finance reform and banking reform and so forth like that. These all have to happen together in a package. So the people are in these different reforms, but we have to coalesce with them for the broader issue of trying to solve income and wealth inequality. That's my.
Thanks, Warren. Mike?
All right. Well, as some of you were talking, I happen to remember back to the days when I used to do a weekly seminar at this halfway house. So this is a program that the inmates in the prison had hooked me up with. And a lot of people came through there, relatively well-known criminals. And one of them was the former commissioner of highways in the state of Delaware. And I knew how come he was in jail, because he was caught in a sting operation where this guy had bribed him for information about where the highway was going to be built. So as we're doing our Socratic settlement of this territory, he says, well, I would settle that land right here because they're going to build a highway. He couldn't let it go. He was one step ahead. He was a quintessential land speculator. Now, the other most prominent celebrity that was in my class there was a land slumlord, Wilmington's most famous slumlord. And he kept putting off fixing up his places, and they finally put him in jail for about, I don't know, 60 days or something like that. And so he went through this halfway house. So we're going through the seminar, and they would call these guys out to go talk to the doctor and different things. So he got called out for some reason. I said, just hold it. I'm gonna wait till he comes back because I want him to hear this. And they all went along with me, the other inmates. So when he came back, I resumed the seminar. We got to the point where we introduced land speculation and finally the tax on land values. And you know what he said? He said, you know, that sounds a lot like Henry George.
How about if we get a last comment from Bret before we break?
Yeah.
I like Henry's quote from years ago. He says, Bret, we have a solution to a problem that nobody knows we have.
Amen.
Amen,
So-
definitely.
Yeah.
I still think this is a spoonful at a time, and you just can't hit anybody with the quick fix. It might sink in for a few people. Most people will go right over the top of their head.
Well, listen, I hope you've enjoyed this. I hope you've gotten something, tangible out of it. As I said, I invite you to send me your thoughts so I can pull them together, and maybe we can come up with some new ideas for each of us individually, and maybe to pass on to our CGO member organizations and others that we know that will be helpful and effective. So Sue, I'll let you close the session.
Yeah, close up. I want to say that this session presentation was made possible through the support of the Robert Schalkenbach Foundation. When this tape is edited, there will be a logo for the Schalkenbach Foundation as part of it. I also want to thank the members of the Foundation for Economic Justice, the Henry George Institute, and Common Ground USA for helping us. Next session is this coming Sunday with Dominic Frisby. at 2 o'clock Eastern time. We initially thought it was 1 o'clock, but I found out yesterday that it will be at 2 o'clock. The announcement will be going out tomorrow morning. Next Tuesday, Ed is back along with Wynn, and you want to talk about what you're going to talk about next Tuesday night?
Yeah, Wynn and I will be joined by Josie Foz of the Schockenbach Foundation and Dan Sullivan of Saving Communities. And we're going to talk about the research database that the four of us in our organizations have produced that can be used for effective research.
Okay. All right. Thank you very much for attending. And again, stay tuned for this coming Sunday, the 31st at 2 Eastern, 1 Central Time, and the like. So thank you very much for coming. Take care. Bye for
Good
now.
night, all.
All right.
Bye-bye.
I guess we could do applause like this, too.
Yes, yes. Yeah. All right. Bye for now.